Hi everybody, welcome back to the video lectures that we're doing. So today we're going to move a bit away from Greek mythology, but continue our theme of creation myths, and take an opportunity to look specifically at some creation myths from a certain part of the world, which is North America, the ancient Native American creation myths. Which are still known today through interviews and discussions and older interviews as well, but also modern members of Native American tribes. And I want to explore some of the themes there and see how those creation myths compare to Greek creation myth. And we'll use that to continue this creation myths topic. And then here in a later video that's going to be posted today, I'm going to take a look at other creation myths around the world. And that'll start us off on the topic of creation myths and give you guys a chance to do a writing project on creation myths where you or whatever one that you like. So let's dive into these myths and see what we can learn from them and see what, because myths evoke their particular culture, what can we learn about this particular culture? And we're kind of focusing both broad and specific. The chapter in the book, chapter 8, details a lot of these creation myths, but for simplicity's sake, one, which was the Navajo creation myth. But what we're going to find is that they're all kind of interrelated, especially the creation myths from a certain part of the world, which is the American Southwest. So sort of the area of Arizona and Utah, not too far from Colorado either, to tell the truth. There are connections to the Navajo here, but more in the sort of area of New Mexico and Arizona and Utah. So all the different cultures, all the different tribes that are in that area seem to have certain connections in their myths. And in a more general sense, Native American creation myths and Native American mythologies in general have a lot of different connections. I guess it's kind of the old question of, splitting versus joining together in terms of the ways that the stories evolve. Some stories that are very similar suggest that there's a common ancestor that they evolved and they split apart. Others suggest that, they grew more similar over time. With Native American myths, I think it's more like they evolved from a common ancestor in a lot of cases. And, these cultures were interacting with each other too. So let's take a look at what we've got here. The big theme that I really want to focus on is the idea of the emergence. So this is a myth that we see in a lot of different cultures, including the Hopi, the Navajo, who we're particularly focusing on, the Zuni, the Iroquois, also the Polynesians, who are the Pacific Islander culture that's involved in Hawaii and Australia and certain parts of North and South America and Central America. All these cultures seem to have a story where basically there are multiple worlds. The world has to be created multiple times, or maybe all these worlds exist already, but human beings have to journey, or somebody has to journey from one world to the next. And the weird thing is, quite frequently, they climb. It's sort of a story as if, our history was once upon a time people lived in the center of the earth, and then they climbed up to our earth. Or possibly there were just layers and layers of worlds, which is what these stories describe. The Polynesian creation myth, for instance, describes in the first world human beings not being very well formed. They didn't have proper arms and legs, but they stood on top of each other's shoulders and climbed, some of them anyway, climbed to the next world. And then they were doing okay there, but then their children better shaped, but then that still didn't work out for them, so they climbed to the next world and the next. And this diagram shows, the people over time, and finally they got to the world where they, which is our world, where they could settle. But maybe the gods keep recreating the world, and they choose to, guide people to climb up out of these darker, more interior worlds. And finally we get to the sky. And of course, the sky of one world is the earth of the next world, which is just a cool concept in general. But let's look at the specific example of the Navajo. Okay, so this story comes to us from the Dine Bahane, which is the story of the people. basically the Navajo creation myth. And like a lot of stories, there are a lot of different versions. The ones we have multiple versions that are written down from interviews with members of the Navajo tribe and taken from observing rituals and the stories that they tell in these rituals. And that's something to think about for all these myths, is usually there's some kind of context in which people are telling these stories. They're, often doing some sort of religious ceremony. And this is true for the Diné Bahane. And what we have is 4 worlds that evoke the different colors of that are considered important to the Navajo people, and kind of represent the 4 directions in a certain way. And we have symbols of corn, the food that people eat, the food that they grow to sustain themselves. So this is the story, and it connects to this idea of the emergence. So the story goes this. We don't start off following humans. We start off following a different group of people. These are known as the air spirit of people. And some parts of the story explain that the air spirit people live very short lives, but they can fly around in the air. And they seem to be bugs, kind of. They seem to be insects. At a couple of points, they're described as grasshoppers or locusts. And so we have these bug people who, they're going on an adventure. So it's hard to say whether we should think of them as more like, acting like people do or acting like bugs do. But that's the whole point, right? Is that they sort of blurred the lines. And that's something we can see in a lot of Native American traditions, is entities, people who blur the lines between human and animal in some way. So the air spirit people, they live in a world deep underground, but they basically irritate everybody around them and they get banished. The king of the frogs and the king of the herons are both mad because they have basically committed adultery. They are breaking the marriage rules of each other and possibly seducing the wives of the Heron King and the Frog King and other important people like that. So these guys just cannot stop cheating on people or causing cheating to happen. And so then they travel to another world. So they fly up to the next world, and because they're bugs, they can fly. And some bird people greet them. It's different birds each time and different colors that represent the sort of important colors. And then they offend, the swallows by sleeping with their wives and, causing all these kinds of problems. So they keep causing these problems. They keep offending people. And this seems to go against a traditional Navajo value of, order and, harmony. This is a word, hozo, which is sometimes translated as harmony. Seems to be a very important value in Navajo communities. And so their ancestors, the reason they ran into so much trouble is because they kept violating this value. So it's a bit of a cautionary tale. But finally, the air spirit people managed to calm down and settle in a world, the 4th on their list, and the highest up that they'd flown to. And this world is a mix of colors. So they are able to, so it's a sign that there's good things here, that it's all worked out. They have some interesting encounters. They meet a weird people who cut their hair square in the front. They have weird square bangs. And here's the weirdest thing. They plant things in the ground and they grow them. So this culture is weirded out by the existence of these farmers. So it seems like maybe this myth dates back to a time before farming existed. And what these farmers, who are called the Kisani, what they probably actually are is the Pueblo, another tribe living in the area. And so this is an early cultural encounter. And they also meet a god. They just kind of stumble on some gods who are hanging out in the 4th world. And the gods are called the Holy People. And the Holy People and the Air Spirit people, they team up and they decide to create the first humans. And so they take some corn and they do a magic ritual on the corn. And the ears of corn become the first human beings. And so from there, you have the first man and the first woman. And here they are holding the corn, which is eventually going to be an important crop when people start growing things. And so it makes sense. It's the foundation of life. So that's where these lives came from. And then in turn,